The fluorescent lights above my desk flickered with that familiar electric hum that had become the soundtrack to my life. 3 years working the graveyard shift at the county's emergency dispatch center, and I still wasn't used to the weight of silence that pressed down on everything after midnight. My name is Marcus Chen, and on this particular Tuesday night in October, I thought I was prepared for anything. I was wrong. The digital clock on my computer screen read 2:47 a.m. when the first call came in. Line 3 lit up with that distinctive red glow that meant someone, somewhere, was having the worst night of their life. I adjusted my headset and clicked accept. The woman's voice that filled my ears was barely above a whisper, trembling with a terror so raw it made the hair on my arms stand up. She was trapped in her bathroom, she said. Someone had broken into her house. She could hear them moving around downstairs, searching for her. The way she described it, methodical and patient, like they had all the time in the world. Her address was 1247 Maple Street, and she gave me her name, Sarah Mitchell. I immediately dispatched 2 patrol units to the location while keeping her on the line. Standard procedure. But something about this call felt different from the beginning. Maybe it was the way she described the intruder's movements, too precise, too calculated. Or maybe it was the strange electronic interference that kept cutting through our connection, like static that almost sounded like whispers. The responding officers arrived at 1247 Maple Street within 6 minutes. I stayed connected with Sarah while coordinating with Officer Bradley and Officer Nash as they approached the house. The property was dark, they reported, no signs of forced entry. No vehicles in the driveway other than what appeared to be the resident's car. That's when the first discrepancy hit me. Bradley's voice crackled through the radio. "Dispatch, we've got a problem. According to county records, 1247 Maple Street has been vacant for 8 months. Previous resident moved out after a death in the family." I felt my stomach drop. I looked at my screen, confirmed the address Sarah had given me, then keyed my mic to respond to Bradley. But before I could speak, Sarah's voice came through my headset again, more urgent now. She said they were upstairs. She could hear footsteps in the hallway outside the bathroom door, slow, deliberate footsteps that stopped right outside. She was crying now, begging me not to hang up, telling me she could see shadows moving under the door. I found myself in an impossible situation. The officers were standing outside an empty house, but I had a woman on the line who was clearly terrified and in immediate danger. I made the call to have them check the house anyway, vacant or not. Bradley and Nash entered through the unlocked front door. I listened to their radio chatter as they cleared each room. Empty. No signs of habitation. Dust covers on furniture, mail piled up from months ago. The bathroom door was open, and there was no one inside. But Sarah was still on my line, still whispering, still terrified. I asked her to describe what she could see from where she was hiding. She told me about the white tile floor, the blue shower curtain, the small window above the toilet that she'd considered climbing through, but was too afraid to try. She described family photos on the hallway wall outside, photos of her and her late husband, photos of her 2 children who lived across the country now. The details were too specific, too real. Officer Nash's voice came through the radio. "Dispatch, we've got a problem."
According to county records, Sarah Mitchell died 3 months ago, natural causes. Funeral was in August. The line went dead.
I stared at my screen, my hands shaking slightly as I reached for my coffee cup. The call had lasted 18 minutes. I had a complete recording, timestamps, everything documented according to protocol. But according to everyone else, I'd just spent 18 minutes talking to a dead woman. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone was playing a sick prank, using the dead woman's identity. Maybe they'd researched the house, knew enough details to make it convincing. But that didn't explain how they knew about the photos in the hallway, the specific layout of a house they supposedly couldn't access. I filed my report and tried to put it out of my mind. Weird calls happened sometimes. People pranked emergency services. It wasn't unheard of, even if this one had been particularly elaborate and disturbing. 2 hours passed. I handled 3 more calls: a drunk driver accident on Highway 12, a domestic disturbance that turned out to be a couple arguing about whose turn it was to take out the trash, and a false alarm at a jewelry store downtown. Normal stuff. The kind of calls that reminded me why most nights were routine. Then, at 5:23 a.m., line 3 lit up again. I almost didn't answer it. Something in my gut told me not to, but protocol is protocol, and there was always the chance that someone actually needed help. The voice was the same, Sarah Mitchell, calling from her bathroom, trapped in her house with an intruder downstairs. But this time, the details were different. She said she was hiding in the basement instead of the bathroom. She described a finished basement with wood paneling and a pool table. Said she could hear footsteps on the floor above her. The address she gave was the same, 1247 Maple Street. I felt cold sweat beating on my forehead as I listened. This wasn't the same call. The layout was different. The hiding spot was different. But the voice, the terror, the name, and the address, all identical. I dispatched units again, though I knew what they'd find. Empty house, no signs of disturbance, no Sarah Mitchell. Because Sarah Mitchell was dead. But this time, I decided to dig deeper. During the 22 minutes I kept Sarah on the line, I used my second computer to pull up everything I could find about her. Obituaries, public records, property transfers. Sarah Mitchell, age 67, had indeed died of natural causes on August 15th. Heart attack in her sleep. She'd lived alone at 1247 Maple Street for 38 years after her husband died in a car accident. The obituary mentioned that she'd been found by her neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, after she failed to collect her mail for 3 days. No signs of foul play. No mystery. Just a lonely old woman who died alone in the house she'd called home for most of her adult life. But here's what made my blood run cold. According to the property transfer documents, Sarah Mitchell's house had never had a finished basement. The architectural plans showed a dirt floor cellar used only for storage. No wood paneling, no pool table, no place to hide. So who was I talking to? And how did they know details about a basement that didn't exist? The second call ended abruptly, just like the first. No goodbye, no final scream, just silence. I sat in my chair, staring at the blinking cursor on my incident report, trying to figure out what to write. I decided to call Mrs. Henderson myself. It was early, but she was elderly and probably awake anyway. I identified myself as County Dispatch and asked if she'd noticed any unusual activity at the Mitchell house. Mrs. Henderson's voice was sharp despite the early hour. She told me she'd been keeping an eye on the place since Sarah died, making sure no one tried to break in or vandalize it. She'd seen the police cars earlier that night and wondered what was going on.
No, she hadn't seen anyone around the property. No, she'd never heard of Sarah having a finished basement. But then she said something that made my hands start shaking again. She told me Sarah had called her once, about a week before she died. Sarah had been confused, disoriented. She insisted someone was in her house, said she was hiding and needed help. The doctor later said it might have been a minor stroke, something that could cause temporary confusion and paranoia. Sarah had been hiding in her bathroom that night, according to Mrs. Henderson, just like in my first call.
I thanked Mrs. Henderson and hung up, my mind racing. Was I somehow receiving calls from the past? Was there some glitch in the system that was playing back old recordings? But that didn't make sense either. Emergency calls aren't stored in a way that could randomly replay through active lines. I spent the rest of my shift researching everything I could about 1247 Maple Street, property history, previous owners, any incidents or disturbances reported over the years. What I found only deepened the mystery. The house had been built in 1962 by a contractor named David Holloway. David had lived there with his wife and daughter until 1978, when he died in a construction accident. His wife, Margaret, had continued living there until 1985, when she died of complications from diabetes. Here's where it got interesting. Margaret Holloway had made several emergency calls in her final months. 3 calls, all between 2 a.m. and 6 a.m., all reporting intruders in her house. Police had responded each time and found nothing. Margaret had died alone in her house, and neighbors later said she'd been suffering from dementia. The house had sat empty for 2 years before Sarah and her husband bought it in 1987. Sarah's husband, Robert, had died in 1991, leaving Sarah alone in the house for the rest of her life. I found 2 more emergency calls in the records, both from Sarah Mitchell, both in the months before her husband's death, both reporting intruders, both resulting in no evidence of break-ins. A pattern was emerging, and it terrified me. My shift ended at 7 a.m., but I couldn't bring myself to leave. I sat in my car in the parking lot staring at my phone, debating whether to drive to 1247 Maple Street myself. Part of me needed to see the place with my own eyes, to confirm what I already knew but couldn't accept. The house stood exactly as Officer Bradley had described it. Empty, dark, with newspapers piled on the front porch and weeds growing through cracks in the driveway. The windows were dusty and covered from the inside, giving the whole place a hollow, abandoned feel. I walked around the perimeter, looking for anything unusual. The basement windows were at ground level on the side of the house, and I could see through the grimy glass into what was clearly an unfinished cellar. Dirt floor, stone walls, a few cardboard boxes stacked in the corner. No wood paneling, no pool table. As I stood there in the morning sunlight, trying to reconcile what I'd seen with what I'd heard, my phone rang. It was my supervisor, Janet. She'd reviewed my incident reports from the night and wanted to discuss them with me before I went home. Apparently, dispatching units to the same empty house twice in one night had raised some flags. I met Janet at a diner near the station and told her everything. Every detail, every discrepancy, every impossible thing I had experienced. I expected her to recommend counseling or suggest I take some time off. Instead, she got very quiet and asked me to wait while she made a phone call. 20 minutes later, she returned to our booth with a manila folder. Inside were incident reports going back 15 years, all emergency calls received between 2 o'clock and 6 a.m., all from women reporting intruders in their homes, all from addresses where the women had died alone within months of making the calls. Janet told me I wasn't the first dispatcher to experience this. In fact, it happened to someone about once every 2 or 3 years. Always the same pattern.
Calls from deceased women reporting intruders, providing details that shouldn't be possible for them to know. The department had a protocol for it, she said. Unofficial, unwritten, but understood by senior staff. Respond to the calls as if they're real, because in some way they couldn't explain. They were real. Document everything. Don't talk about it outside the department. She told me about Marcus Webb, who'd worked dispatch in the early 2000s. He'd received similar calls from a woman named Dorothy Kane, who died 6 months earlier. Marcus had become obsessed with the case, started visiting the houses, trying to find logical explanations. He'd quit after a few months and moved to another state. There was Linda Rodriguez, who'd gotten calls from 3 different deceased women over the course of a year in 2018. She'd handled it better, Janet said, but had requested a transfer to day shift as soon as a position opened up. I looked through the files, reading incident reports that mirrored my own experience almost exactly. Different names, different addresses, but the same impossible circumstances, the same terror in voices that should have been silent. Janet leaned across the table and looked me directly in the eyes. "The question isn't whether this is really happening," she said. "The question is why it's happening to you." That question haunted me for the rest of the day. I tried to sleep, but couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Sarah Mitchell's voice, scared and alone, begging me not to hang up. When I returned to work that night, I found myself hoping the phones would stay quiet. But at 3:17 a.m., line 3 lit up again. This time, Sarah was in the attic. She described dusty floorboards and Christmas decorations stored in old boxes. She could hear someone moving around in the rooms below, she said, systematically searching the house. Her voice was different this time, weaker, more resigned, as if she knew how this would end. I kept her on the line for 31 minutes. I dispatched officers, knowing they'd find nothing. I asked her questions about the house, about her life, about what was happening to her. Some of her answers were consistent with the previous calls. Others weren't. When I asked her what year it was, she said 1985. When I asked her name, she said Margaret Holloway. The call ended with a sound I'll never forget, a wet, gurgling noise, followed by silence. I sat at my desk, staring at my computer screen, trying to process what had just happened. Was I talking to Sarah Mitchell? Margaret Holloway? Someone else entirely? And why were they calling me? Over the next several nights, the calls continued. Sometimes it was Sarah, sometimes Margaret, sometimes voices I didn't recognize. Always women, always alone, always terrified. The details of their hiding spots changed, but the address remained the same, 1247 Maple Street. I started keeping a journal, documenting every call, every detail, every inconsistency. I mapped out the different versions of the house they described, trying to understand the pattern. Sometimes the house had a basement, sometimes it didn't. Sometimes there was an attic full of storage. Sometimes the attic was empty. Sometimes there were family photos in the hallway. Sometimes the walls were bare. It was as if I was receiving calls from different versions of the same house, different timelines, where different people had lived and died alone. On my 7th night of receiving these calls, something changed. The voice that came through my headset at 2:54 a.m. was younger than the others. She said her name was Lisa Chen, and she was hiding in a closet in the master bedroom. She could hear someone trying to break down the front door. The address was different this time, 1247 Oak Street, not Maple Street. But Oak Street was my street. 1247 Oak Street was my address. My hands shook as I pulled up the property records on my computer. Lisa Chen had been the previous owner of my house. She died 8 months ago, 3 months before I'd moved in. Heart attack, according to the death certificate. Found by her landlord after she'd missed rent payments. I looked around my apartment, suddenly aware of every shadow, every creak of the building settling. Lisa was describing my closet, my bedroom, my front door. She was hiding in the same closet where I kept my work uniforms. "Please don't hang up," she whispered through my headset. "I can hear them coming up the stairs now. They're almost to my door." I wanted to end the call, to rip off my headset and run from the building. But something in her voice kept me frozen in place. She was so scared, so alone, and I was the only person in the world who could hear her. "I'm here," I told her, though she couldn't hear me. None of them could hear me. I was just listening to their final moments, their last desperate attempts to reach someone, anyone who might be able to help. The call lasted 43 minutes. I listened to Lisa Chen die in my closet, in a timeline where she'd never moved out, where I'd never moved in, where she'd spent her final moments terrified and alone. When the line went dead, I sat in my chair and cried. The next morning, I called in sick. I couldn't face another night of those calls, couldn't handle hearing another voice from beyond pleading for help I couldn't give. But as I sat in my apartment, staring at the closet where Lisa Chen had died in some other version of reality, I realized something that chilled me to the bone. If I was receiving calls from women who died alone in their homes, women who'd made desperate emergency calls in their final moments, what did that mean for me? I thought about my life, my isolation. I worked nights, slept days, rarely saw my neighbors or made social connections. If something happened to me, how long would it be before anyone noticed? How long would it be before someone found my body? That evening, despite my fear, I returned to work. I had to understand what was happening, had to find some way to break the cycle I was apparently part of. The first call came at 3:22 a.m. A woman named Patricia Vance, hiding in a kitchen pantry at 1247 Elm Street. The same terror, the same desperation, the same inevitable silence at the end. I looked up Patricia Vance in the system. Dead 4 months ago, natural causes, found alone in her kitchen by a concerned neighbor. The pattern was becoming clear, and it was more terrifying than I'd imagined. These weren't random calls from random dead women. They were calls from women who died alone, who'd reached out for help in their final moments and found none. They were stuck somehow, replaying their last desperate attempts to connect with another human being. And I was the one receiving their calls because I was like them, alone, isolated, forgotten. But why was the system connecting me to them? What was it about the emergency dispatch network that could somehow bridge the gap between life and death, between their timeline and mine? I spent the rest of that shift researching the technical infrastructure of the emergency system, radio frequencies, digital switching, signal routing. I wasn't an expert, but I knew enough about technology to start forming a theory. Emergency dispatch systems are designed to connect people in crisis with people who can help. They're built to bridge distances,
to find the shortest path between someone who needs help and someone who can provide it. The system is sophisticated, adaptive, constantly routing and rerouting to ensure connections are made.
What if, in some way I couldn't fully understand, the system was working exactly as designed? What if it was detecting my isolation, my similarity to these women, and routing their trapped calls to the one person who could truly understand their situation? What if the system knew I was going to die alone, just like them? The thought made me physically ill, but I couldn't shake it. Every woman whose call I'd received had died alone in their home. They'd all made emergency calls in the months before their deaths, reporting intruders that weren't there, dangers that existed only in their minds. Was I following the same pattern? Was my ability to receive their calls a sign that I was heading toward the same fate? I looked around the dispatch center, at my coworkers handling normal calls from living people with real emergencies. None of them seemed to hear what I was hearing. None of them were trapped in this cycle of impossible communication with the dead. At 4:45 a.m., my phone rang. Not the dispatch line, my personal cell phone. The caller ID showed my own number. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding, as my phone continued to ring. Finally, I answered. My own voice came through the speaker, terrified and desperate. "Please, someone help me. They're in my apartment. I'm hiding in the bathroom. I can hear them looking for me." I was listening to myself make an emergency call from my own bathroom, in my own apartment, describing an intruder that wasn't there. But I was sitting at my desk at the dispatch center. I wasn't home. I wasn't hiding in my bathroom. I wasn't in danger. Or was I? The call continued, my own voice describing details of my apartment that were perfectly accurate. The broken tile near the bathtub, the squeaky floorboard outside the bathroom door, the water stain on the ceiling from the upstairs neighbor's leak last month. I listened to myself die.
The call ended with the same wet, gurgling sound I'd heard from all the others. Then, silence. I sat at my desk, my hands shaking uncontrollably, trying to understand what had just happened. Was I already dead? Was I trapped in some kind of loop, taking calls from other dead dispatchers who were also trapped? Or was this a warning? A glimpse of my future, a chance to change course before it was too late? I looked at the clock. 5:17 a.m. My shift ended at 7 a.m. I could leave work, go home, check my apartment, prove to myself that I was still alive, still real, still in control of my own fate. But what if going home was exactly what would trigger the events I'd just heard? What if by returning to my apartment, I'd be setting in motion the exact scenario that would lead to my death? I spent the rest of my shift paralyzed with indecision. Every few minutes, I'd check my pulse, touch my face, perform small tests to confirm I was still among the living. But doubt gnawed at me. If I was receiving calls from dead people, how could I be sure I wasn't dead myself? When 7 a.m. arrived, I didn't leave. I couldn't. The day shift dispatcher, Kelly Martinez, found me still at my desk, staring at my phone. "Marcus, your replacement is here. You can go home." Kelly's voice sounded distant, muffled, as if she was speaking to me through water. When I looked at her, her face seemed to flicker like a bad television signal. Was she real? Was I real? Was any of this real? I tried to speak, to explain what had happened, but no words came out. Kelly was looking at me with concern, then alarm. She called for a supervisor, and soon I was surrounded by people asking if I was okay, if I needed medical attention.
I could see their mouths moving, but their voices sounded far away and distorted. The fluorescent lights above seemed to flicker in sync with their words, creating a strobe effect that made my head pound. Finally, I managed to stand up and walk toward the exit. Every step felt like I was moving through thick liquid. The familiar hallways of the dispatch center seemed to stretch and warp around me. Outside, the morning sun felt cold against my skin. I got in my car and drove home on autopilot, my mind reeling with possibilities, all of them terrifying. My apartment building looked exactly as it always had, but something felt different. The shadows seemed deeper, the silence more complete. I climbed the stairs to my floor, each step echoing in the empty stairwell. My desk apartment door was closed and locked, just as I'd left it. I inserted my key with trembling hands and stepped inside. Everything was normal. No signs of intrusion, no evidence of danger. My bathroom was empty, the broken tile still broken, the squeaky floorboard still squeaky. But as I stood in my living room, looking around at my sparse furnishings and empty walls, I realized something that made my blood run cold. This wasn't living. This was just existing. I had no friends, no family I spoke to regularly, no hobbies or interests outside of work. I went to work, came home, slept, and repeated the cycle. Day after day, month after month, year after year. I was already dead. I just hadn't stopped breathing yet. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The women whose calls I'd been receiving weren't contacting me randomly. They were reaching out to someone who understood their situation, someone who was living the same isolated, meaningless existence they'd lived. The emergency dispatch system wasn't malfunctioning. It was working perfectly, connecting the dead and the dying, the forgotten and the soon-to-be forgotten. I was part of their network now, a node in a system of souls who died alone and afraid, desperate to make one last connection with another human being. But unlike them, I still had a choice. I could break the cycle, change my life, reach out to people while I still could. I could prove the system wrong, show that my fate wasn't sealed.
That afternoon, I called my sister in California. We hadn't spoken in 2 years, but she seemed genuinely happy to hear from me. We talked for an hour about our lives, our memories, our hopes for the future. It was the longest conversation I'd had with another person outside of work in months. I called my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, and offered to help her with her grocery shopping. She was elderly and had trouble getting around, and she accepted gratefully. We made plans for the following weekend. I researched volunteer opportunities in my area, looking for ways to connect with my community, to make myself part of something larger than my own lonely existence. For the first time in years, I felt hopeful. I felt alive. That night, I returned to work with a new perspective. When Line 3 lit up at 2:33 a.m., I was ready. The voice was unfamiliar this time, a woman named Helen Porter, calling from 1247 Pine Street. She was hiding in a bedroom closet, terrified of an intruder who was searching her house. But instead of just listening passively, I tried something different. I spoke back. "Helen, can you hear me? You're not alone anymore." The voice on the other end paused, and for a moment I thought I'd imagined it. Then, impossibly, She responded. Who is this? Can you help me? My heart pounded with excitement and terror. She could hear me. For the first time, one of them could actually hear me. My name is Marcus. I'm here to help. You're safe now. You're not alone. Helen's voice began to change, becoming calmer, less frightened. She told me about her life, her loneliness, her fear of dying forgotten. As she spoke, her voice grew stronger, more peaceful. Thank you, she said finally. Thank you for listening. I can let go now. The line went quiet, but it wasn't the abrupt silence I'd grown accustomed to. This was peaceful, complete. Helen had found what she was looking for, someone who understood, someone who cared enough to listen. Over the following nights, I received more calls, and each time I was able to respond. I listened to their stories, acknowledged their fears, validated their experiences. One by one, I helped them find peace. But more importantly, I was changing my own life. I was building connections, forming relationships, becoming part of a community. The isolation that had made me a perfect receiver for these desperate calls was slowly dissolving. 3 weeks later, on a quiet Tuesday night, Line 3 remained dark. No calls from the dead, no voices from beyond reaching out for help. The network had found other routes, other connections. I was no longer alone, which meant I was no longer part of their system. As I sat at my desk, fielding normal emergency calls from living people with real problems, I thought about the women whose final moments I'd shared. They taught me something valuable about the importance of human connection, about the tragedy of dying alone and forgotten. I'd helped them find peace, and in doing so, I had saved myself from joining them. The emergency dispatch system continued to work as designed, connecting people who needed help with people who could provide it. But now, instead of routing calls from the dead to the dying, it was connecting the living with the living, the way it was supposed to. And somewhere in that vast network of human connection, I'd found my place among the living. But sometimes, late at night when the phones are quiet and the fluorescent lights hum their electric lullaby, I still listen carefully to the silence, because I know that somewhere out there, another lonely dispatcher might be receiving calls from voices that shouldn't exist, messages from people who died alone and afraid. And if that day comes, if someone needs help understanding what they're experiencing, I'll be ready to listen. After all, we're all part of the same network. We're all connected in ways we don't fully understand. And sometimes, the most important calls are the ones that help us realize we're not alone. The night shift continues. The phones keep ringing. And somewhere between the calls from the living and the echoes of the dead, we find our purpose. We answer when people call, even when they're calling from beyond.